August 31st, 1944. A requisitioned house near Amiens, France. Before sunrise, a German general was asleep in a real bed for the first time in weeks. Not a cot, not the back seat of a staff car. A bed. He had spent 5 years building the kind of reputation German officers understood instantly. Armored thrusts in Russia, defensive fighting in Normandy. The long, punishing work of keeping broken formations alive after orders from above had already ruined them. 3 weeks earlier, he had warned High Command that one more attack in Normandy would not save the front. It would destroy what was left of it. They ordered the attack anyway. It failed. And by the end of August, he was doing the one maneuver German officers had been trained to believe they could still execute even after disaster.
Retreat, save the army, reach the next river, rebuild the line. That was the calculation. Then he woke up. British soldiers were standing in his bedroom. They had not chased him from behind. They had driven around the broken map. In roughly 1 day, British armor had covered open country fast enough to arrive at Amiens before the German command structure believed it was physically possible. The general had not been captured because he had lost his nerve. He had been captured because the front had started moving faster than his idea of a front could survive. That morning was not an isolated humiliation. It was a preview. Across France, Belgium, and then Germany itself, the same pattern repeated with a violence that looked almost unreal to the men caught inside it. German commanders ordered withdrawals by the book. Within hours, the roads they meant to use were already cut. A pocket closed at Falaise. Another closed near Mons. In the Ruhr, an entire army group folded into one of the largest mass captures of the European war. And after the war, when German generals wrote studies for American historians, the complaint kept returning in different forms. They understood defeat. They understood retreat. They understood pursuit. What they could not explain was how the Americans kept arriving first. The usual answers are too small. It was not simply Patton's personality, though his aggression mattered. It was not better tanks, because in direct mechanical terms the Sherman was not a Panther. It was not air power alone, though air power was essential. The real answer was colder than hero worship. The United States had built a moving system: trucks, radios, artillery, fighter bombers, maintenance, fuel, forward observers, commanders allowed to act before a perfect order arrived. Not pieces, a system. And the German army, for all its tactical skill, had no equivalent machine for moving an entire front through time. The first misunderstanding to kill the German retreat was one that still survives in popular memory. The Wehrmacht was not a fully motorized army. The image is steel columns and black crosses, panzers racing through dust, engines growling across Europe. That image was real, but it was only the spearhead. Behind it came the shaft of the spear, and the shaft walked. By late 1943, only a small fraction of German Army and SS divisions carried armored or motorized designations. By late 1944, the proportion had not improved in any meaningful way. German horse strength remained enormous through the war, with roughly 1 million animals in service at any given moment. A standard infantry division might hold thousands of horses, more than 1,000 horse-drawn vehicles, and fewer than 1,000 motor vehicles. That meant a German division could be tactically brilliant and still be operationally slow. It could fight hard from a village. It could ambush armor at a bend in the road. It could hold a hedgerow longer than anyone expected. But when the order came to withdraw suddenly, its guns, kitchens, ammunition, medical wagons, and much of its supply life moved at the pace of animals. The fast part of the army could stab. The rest had to catch up on hooves. For most of military history, that was not fatal. A retreating army usually had one advantage over the pursuer. It could move away on its own route, while rear guards delayed the enemy. The pursuer had to fight, repair roads, clear towns, and guess where the retreat was going. That bought time. Not always enough time, but usually some. German officers had been educated inside that world. They had seen it in Russia. They had practiced it across a war of gigantic distances. Even when Germany was losing in the east, many formations still escaped destruction because withdrawal, delay, and reformation remained possible at the old tempo. But in Western Europe in 1944, the tempo changed. The American Army had been almost unimpressive in 1939. It ranked far below the great land powers. Its cavalry still included far more horse regiments than mechanized ones. Its tank arm was not yet a serious instrument of global war. But inside that small army, officers had been wrestling with two questions that looked boring until they became decisive. First, how do you put not just the tanks, but the whole army on wheels? Second, how do you make that moving army think while it is moving? The first answer came from industry. The United States produced trucks in quantities Germany never approached. The GMC 2.5-ton truck became the bloodstream of American operations. It carried infantry, ammunition, rations, engineers, medical units, fuel drums, spare parts, and the unglamorous weight that lets an army keep fighting after the first dash. By 1944, American infantry divisions could move on wheels in a way German infantry divisions simply could not. And the effect went beyond American units. Soviet motorization in the later war was sustained in large part by hundreds of thousands of American trucks sent through Lend-Lease. Germany captured trucks when it could, pressed civilian vehicles into service when it had to, kept horse columns moving because there was no other way. The Americans did not just have more engines. They organized their army around the assumption that engines were normal. The second answer was radio. Here the difference was not only industrial, it was doctrinal. American radios were everywhere by comparison. In tanks, in artillery nets, in battalion headquarters, with forward observers, with fighter bombers overhead, inside the chain of command that had to change direction while the column was already moving. A forward observer could call for heavy artillery and expect a response in minutes. A tank battalion commander could shift his axis without sending a motorcycle courier into chaos. A pilot overhead could speak to the leading edge of the ground column below. German forces used radios too, especially in command vehicles and mobile formations. But they relied far more heavily on visual control, prearranged artillery plans, and wire communications. Wire worked beautifully when a front was stable. It could be precise, secure, disciplined. But wire has one terrible weakness. It has to be laid. And when the front is moving faster than men can unspool cable, the telephone system becomes an anchor. A German signals crew trying to keep up with a collapsing line was not merely busy. It was solving the wrong century's problem. In February 1943, at Kasserine Pass, the Germans thought they had seen proof that the American army was not ready. Rommel's forces struck US 2 Corps in Tunisia and drove it backward in confusion. Thousands of American soldiers were captured. German confidence found easy confirmation. British doubts found their own. The American army looked clumsy, green, and painfully slow. But armies learn at different speeds, and the American army learned fast. By Sicily, Italy, and France, the same institution that had been embarrassed in Tunisia had begun turning its mistakes into operating procedure. The decisive release came in late July 1944, Operation Cobra. The American plan west of St. Lo was brutal in its simplicity. Concentrate an enormous aerial bombardment on a narrow German front. Punch armor through the rupture. Do not stop to make the flanks look neat. Keep going. The bombing was not clean. Smoke, dust, and aiming error caused short drops. American positions were hit. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair was killed by friendly fire, the highest-ranking American officer killed that way in Europe.
And still the operation continued. That decision matters. It shows the institutional temperament behind the breakthrough. The Americans did not treat speed as a reward for perfect conditions. They treated speed as the condition. On the German side of the bomb line stood Panzer Lehr Division, commanded by Fritz Bayerlein, one of the most experienced armored officers in the German army. On paper, Panzer Lehr was elite. In reality, by the time Cobra struck, it had been ground down by weeks of combat. When orders came from higher command demanding that no man leave his position, Bayerlein's answer was grim. The men were still in their positions because they were dead. Only the dead were still holding the line. The detail that matters most is not just the destruction, it is the disbelief above him. German higher headquarters did not grasp how quickly the crisis was opening. They still imagined a breakthrough in the familiar rhythm. Hours of warning, reports moving upward, orders coming down, reserves shifted before the entire map overturned. But the map was already moving. American armor did not behave like the German staff expected an armored breakthrough to behave. It did not pause to tidy the flanks. It did not wait for every uncertainty to settle. It flowed through the gap and forced the situation to explain itself afterward. Within days, American columns were through Avranches. Through the bottleneck at Pontebalt, the newly activated Third Army poured men and vehicles at a scale that looked less like a pursuit and more like a flood under mechanical discipline. Roughly 200,000 men and tens of thousands of vehicles moved through in a matter of days. This was not one armored spear point racing ahead while the rest of the army crept behind. The body moved with the blade. That was the difference. The German answer was still shaped by Hitler's orders and by an older geometry. Attack toward Mortain. Cut the American corridor. Restore the front. But while German armor pushed west, American columns were already sweeping east, then north, then northeast. The battlefield inverted. The Germans were attacking toward the coast while the Americans were moving behind them. British and Canadian forces pressed down from the north. The trap became Falaise. Even there, the Allies did not execute the perfect encirclement. Patton wanted to keep pushing north. Bradley halted part of the movement near Argentan, worried about boundary confusion and collision with forces coming from the opposite side. The gap stayed open longer than it might have. Some Germans escaped. But the price of escape was ruin. By the time the pocket closed, tens of thousands were prisoners, thousands were dead, and formations that did get out had often left behind the very things that made them armies: tanks, guns, trucks, horses, wagons, records, signal equipment, repair capability. They escaped as fragments. That is why Falaise was not only a battle, it was a timing failure. German commanders had expected the old interval between defeat and encirclement. The Americans erased that interval. Then it happened again. At the end of August, as the German front in northern France broke apart, 3 German Corps headquarters found themselves nearly cut loose from higher command. Their leaders improvised a provisional army from fragments, stragglers, and exhausted formations. The decision was professional. Even sensible. They needed a route out. They needed terrain that could slow pursuit. They needed to reach a defensible line before the Allies could close across their path. Near Mons in Belgium, the map offered canals, marshes, roads, and a chance. The march was difficult, but not impossible by the assumptions they still trusted. 40 miles, bad roads,
tired men, limited vehicles, yet in the old grammar of retreat, it could be done. But the U.S. First Army was not behind them in the old sense. It was beside them, then ahead of them. American armored divisions were driving parallel to the German line of escape, at road speeds the German foot and horse columns could not match. By the time German officers intercepted Allied radio traffic, the unit designations sounded impossible. Those formations should have been far away. Instead, they were directly in front of them. The Mons pocket closed almost by collision. The American units had not necessarily set out with perfect knowledge of the German mass approaching them. They were advancing on their assigned routes, fast enough that the German withdrawal ran into their movement, like a man stepping into a door he thought was still behind him. Then the air came down. The 9th Tactical Air Command attacked road traffic inside the pocket. On one day alone, its claims included hundreds of motor vehicles and hundreds of horse-drawn vehicles destroyed. That detail should stop the story cold. Hundreds of horse-drawn vehicles. In September 1944, in a war remembered as a war of tanks, American fighter bombers were destroying German wagon columns in Belgium because the German army's logistical reality had never matched its armored legend. By the time the Mons pocket finished collapsing, roughly 25,000 Germans had been taken prisoner, including generals. Again, the issue was not that German officers had forgotten how to retreat. It was that their retreat lived inside a slower operating system. The third piece of the American system came from the air, but not in the simple way people often mean when they say air superiority. Bombers mattered. Fighter sweeps mattered. The destruction of German fuel production mattered enormously. Yet the most dangerous innovation for retreating German columns was more intimate than strategic bombing. It was a radio link between the point of an armored column and the aircraft circling above it. Major General Elwood Pete Quesada believed close air support should be a partnership with ground forces, not a favor granted from the sky when available. Before Cobra, he and Omar Bradley reached a practical arrangement. Put an airman with the right radio in the lead tank. Let that man talk directly to fighter bombers overhead. Make the airplane an extension of the column's eyes. The modification was simple. A radio set tuned to fighter frequencies. A pilot or air controller riding inside a Sherman. P-47 Thunderbolts orbiting above the leading armored column, relieved on station so cover did not lapse. The consequences were not simple. A tank crew looking down a Normandy road could see the hedgerow ahead. A P-47 pilot circling above could see what waited beyond it. The anti-tank gun, the blocked bridge, the panzer hidden near a crossroads, the supply wagons hurrying along a secondary road before anyone on the ground could reach them. The man in the tank could ask. The man in the aircraft could answer. And the answer could arrive in machine gun fire, rockets or bombs before the German column had finished understanding that it had been seen. That is what made the American pursuit different. Not just speed, sight. Not just engines, communication. Not just aircraft tied into a moving ground decision. A retreating army has always depended on gaps. Gaps in observation, gaps in road coverage, gaps between one enemy unit and another, gaps between a report and an order. The American system attacked the gaps. Trucks compressed distance, radios compressed decision time, air-ground coordination compressed uncertainty. By late 1944, German commanders were trying to move through spaces that had already been closed by machines they could not always see and information they could not receive quickly enough. This did not mean American operations were flawless. They were not. They outran fuel. They created traffic jams. They made boundary mistakes. They sometimes missed opportunities. They sometimes paid for speed with confusion and friendly casualties. But the deeper fact remained. Their errors occurred inside a faster system. German errors occurred inside a slower one. And in mobile warfare, that difference can turn a mistake on one side into inconvenience, and a mistake on the other into encirclement. The final proof came in Germany itself. April 1st, 1945. Near Lippstadt, elements of the U.S. Ninth Army moving south met elements of the U.S. First Army moving north. There was no grand theatrical moment, no ancient fortress stormed, no single decisive duel. Just American units comparing maps and finding that the ring was closed.
Inside it sat Army Group B under Field Marshal Walter Model, the 5th Panzer Army, the 15th Army, Corps Headquarters, support troops, remnants, staff offices, rear services, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers trapped in the Ruhr.
Model was not an amateur. He had built his reputation as the man sent to stabilize disasters. On the Eastern Front, he had become known for assembling defenses from wreckage and delay from collapse. But in the Ruhr, he faced a problem his old skills could not solve. There were too many American divisions around the ring. Too much artillery, too much air, too little German fuel, too little ammunition, too little mobility left inside the pocket. By mid-April, some German armored formations had no serviceable tanks remaining. Others lacked artillery ammunition.
The pocket was not a maneuver problem anymore. It was a shrinking container. The closing movement had been a demonstration of the same system at mature strength. From the Remagen bridgehead, American forces broke out and drove deep in days. From the north, Ninth Army moved south. The pincers covered distances that would have been major operational achievements by themselves, then met on schedule across central Germany. The German command structure inside the Ruhr still existed on paper. Orders could still be issued. Ranks still mattered. Maps could still be opened on tables. But none of that restored motion. And without motion, an army group became inventory. Mass surrender came in stages. One army lost contact with its subordinate units and capitulated. The pocket split. The eastern half collapsed. The western half followed. Model dissolved his command rather than surrender it intact, then killed himself in a forest rather than become a prisoner. The number of Germans taken in the Ruhr exceeded the German prisoners lost at Stalingrad. The difference was not drama. It was procedure. The Americans had made encirclement repeatable. That is the part easy to miss. Falaise was not a lucky trap. Mons was not just a strange accident. Amiens was not only a general sleeping too long. The Ruhr was not merely the end of a doomed regime. They were linked by one operating fact. The German army had been designed to fight brilliantly in places. The American army had learned to move brilliantly between them. German doctrine had long prized mission-type orders, the idea that subordinate commanders should understand intent and act without waiting for every instruction. In concept, that was German. But by 1944, German command had been bent under political interference, fuel starvation, communications limits, and a logistics base that still depended heavily on horses. Authority narrowed upward at the very moment information needed to move outward. The Americans took a version of decentralized action and gave it radios, trucks, artillery nets, fighter-bomber cover, and a supply system capable of feeding movement instead of merely admiring it. That is why the German officers who survive could describe every symptom and still struggle to name the disease. They saw the failed orders, the lost roads, the impossible American arrivals, the pockets closing before reports could catch up. But from inside the collapse, the system was almost invisible. It did not look like one weapon. It looked like bad timing. A tank column where none should be. A bridge already taken. Aircraft overhead before the wagons cleared the road.
A radio call answered before a staff car could leave headquarters. A retreat route closed before the retreat had properly begun. The German generals had been trained to ask where the enemy was. By 1944, the more dangerous question was how fast the enemy's whole army could know where to go next. And on that question, the answer had changed. The horse army was trying to escape a radio army. The line army was trying to escape a network.
The commanders were trying to retreat through yesterday's map, and the Americans were already driving through tomorrow's.